All right, today we're going to finish off the end of the French and Indian War after the English began to turn the tide in 1757 and 1758. A lot of the credit for that, of course, should go to the English Prime Minister, William Pitt. So we're going to focus on the end of the notes that we had for this section of the class. William Pitt puts in place what we would call a colony first policy in 1757 and 1758. So you've got some new tactics, the American way of fighting. They are able to enlist the Allies with the Iroquois Confederacy, which you can see the writing on the wall after 1758, and they're going to join the English, abandoning their neutrality. But as important, the English government under Pitt says, all right, colonies, you go out and you buy the supplies and you do whatever you need to do to win the war. It's kind of like giving these individual colonial governments a blank check because not a lot of the colonies were interested in cooperating. You know, Franklin's disjointed snake was not too far off as concerned with the way the English colonies often wanted to cooperate, or more importantly, did not want to cooperate with each other. So by the time Pitt implements this idea, the English are also fighting in Europe. In Europe, they call this the 7 Years' War. The Americans have been fighting this conflict for several years at this point. And for the most part, what the English want to do is turn their attention on to Canada and finally remove the French from North America. And they go about that in several ways. And we're going to pull up the map and use, just as we would in class, the notes and also the map. They continue removing the Acadians from Nova Scotia. That's their island off the coast of Canada. So we'll go and take a look at that as we go back and forth with the notes. All of this is part of their method to isolate Quebec and Montreal. When you are able to capture the forts along the Great Lakes, what the English do. For starters, the French have to abandon Fort Duquesne in 1758. They blow up the fort and prevent it from turning it over to the English, and the English just rebuild a larger fort, which they christened Fort Pitt, which is the basis for the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's part of the plan, along with, as I mentioned before, removing all of the Acadians from Nova Scotia. They go to other places such as Canada. They go to areas of the South, including Louisiana. The English are able to once again, because they had captured it after King George's War, they capture Louisbourg. And that, in some ways, kind of spells the doom for Quebec, which they send in their navy and a combined group of American militia and British forces and captured in 1759. So this is often seen as kind of the symbolic end of the fighting in the French and Indian War, but it really isn't. It might be kind of the end of the fighting in North America, but more accurately, what takes place is that the English war machine next turns on Spain. Spain actually joins the French in 1760 to try to help their traditional ally. And all the British do in reaction to the Spanish declaring war on them is turn their built up war machine under William Pitt against the Spanish. In short order, we'll pull up the map in a second, but the English are able to capture with the expedition to Havana, Cuba, the main Spanish island in the Caribbean, the old Spanish colonies in the Philippines, all the way across the world. They kick the French out of India, and the English become the dominant power, which is going to connect them to the trade of tea and other resources. And this causes the different, very beleaguered, meaning tired, uh, belligerents, the folks that are fighting each other, to sit down in Paris, France, and kind of work out an end to this war. So it had been costly for the French, it had been costly for the English and the Spanish as well. And in the background, there's a lot of political changes that are happening. In 1760, King George II dies, and his grandson, George III, becomes the new English monarch. George III is young, he's ambitious, and he wants to be known as the Patriot King. And that's easy when it looks like by 1760, 61, you have kind of this dominant victory in North America. Quebec falls in 1759. Montreal falls in 1760. So let's go to the map and take a look at the extent of the British victories around the world. At the very top of the map, you can see the Philippines. Philippines are captured by the English, given back to uh, the Filipino people because there's an insurrection there. The folks in the Philippines don't really like the English there and give a lot of trouble for them. But I mentioned India, again, at the top right of the map. You can see the fighting that takes place in Europe. England does at least holds the line fighting the French and French allies in Europe. The English become the dominant trading entity or nation in West Africa with battles that take place in Senegambia region during this conflict. Obviously, you can see what happens in North America. The English, again, lead a very costly man and material capture of Cuba, and that's going to be up in the air about whether or not the Spanish can get that back. Number 11 marks the Eastern Caribbean. The British actually capture two of the French sugar islands, and now all the parties involved at the Treaty of Paris in 1762 and 1763 need to sit down and figure out what, if any, territory can change hands. What can the French and the Spanish get back that they lost? And they signed that Treaty of Paris in 1763, one of the most important in world history because it makes England, which we can rightly say Great Britain, England, we use those terms interchangeably, but Great Britain, earlier in the century, in 1707, had put together a union between itself and Scotland. And this is their triumph. This is Pax Britannica, as it's often called, British peace in 1763. Their extent of their empire overseas is larger even than Rome at its height. And a lot of people like to compare, if you want to build this a very impressive empire, they compare it to Rome. And the English definitely do that. There's a lot of appreciation of ancient history. The significant difference is that the English dominance is even more. So if we go to the map again, we need a map to tell you the amount of territory that's changing hands. So we'll show you first this one, which is kind of the before and after in North America. Once we looked at the world map, now we're going to look at the map of the Americas. You can see on the left at the start of the conflict, France has significant claims in purple in North America, along obviously the St. Lawrence River, areas of the Great Lakes, and they extended that with trading posts and missions and other French-controlled territories all the way down the Mississippi River until they linked Canada with Louisiana. That's gone effectively with the Treaty of Paris. You can see on the right panel, 1763, France is gone from North America. The purple is gone. And the English have gotten a new colony, actually two specifically in the region that used to be French. They are able to, again, take control of Canada. The French were okay with that. It hadn't been a very lucrative, or it hadn't gotten the French nation a lot of money to run Canada. They had spent more on it than they got out of it. And they were happy to give what Voltaire, the playwright, called a few acres of snow. He said, that's all we lost is a few acres of snow. But they had to get Canada to the English because they wanted to get back their islands in the Caribbean that they lost. Those tiny sugar islands were much more significant. So the territory of Canada became part of Great Britain. The French stayed there, some left, but they would now be under the control of the English. The region from the mountains all the way over to the Mississippi River was going to be set aside as an Indian reserve. And the Native Americans who were there were kind of left in the lurch, thinking, well, we didn't really feel that we lost. Certainly, the French allied Indians were very good, strong allies. They helped keep the French in the fight for several years because, as we know, the English colonists greatly outnumbered the French colonists in North America. So the new neighbor for British North America along the Mississippi River would be the Spanish. The Spanish then take control of areas of Louisiana, and so especially New Orleans. This is the period of Spanish New Orleans, 1763 to about 1800, a 40-year period where they make an impact in the old French city. The Spanish wanted to desperately get back Cuba, and so they traded. You can see on the left panel, Florida in the orangey color was controlled by Spain, both the peninsula and the panhandle, that's East and West Florida. To get back Cuba, the Spanish were willing to trade the English both Floridas, and the English took control of Florida. Many of the Spanish who were Catholic and didn't want to swear allegiance to the new king, the Protestant George III, left, and they made their way into either Spanish Louisiana or into Cuba itself. So that tells you a little bit about the four new colonies that Great Britain had. And there were going to be a series of new reforms after 1763. The war had proved to be very costly. And you can see one of the first reforms that England puts in place is that they contemplate kind of closing the frontier and separating the colonists from the Native Americans in what was known as the Indian Reserve. So everything from the mountains to the Mississippi River was going to be an area left for the indigenous people there. That was a good idea because when the colonists came over, and a lot of them were disappointed, they were like, oh my gosh, we thought we had been participating in this conflict. France is gone from North America. You can see on this map, this green gray color is nowhere, basically, in North America. And so the Native Americans didn't consider themselves one of the losers of the war, but now they would be under British policies. And British reforms, because the war was so costly, ended up backfiring. So we traditionally think, okay, the war cost a lot. There was a lot more British debt. This is the beginning of what's often called in history as the imperial crisis. It sounds very dramatic. But if Great Britain is triumphant in 1763 and they've got four colonies, they've also got a lot more war debt. So France gone from the continent, Spain now the new neighbor at New Orleans and across the Trans-Mississippi West. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 instituted for England what they thought was a series of reforms that were going to make a lot of sense. These policies, as far as in the Indian Reserve, did not make a lot of sense. In fact, they were quite insulting. So when we look at this time period, it's often called the imperial crisis. We kind of focus on the idea that it has to do with English policies and the unpopular taxation and the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which we're going to get into details about. But the first crisis for the English actually originates in the West. The English decide in 1763 that they're not going to carry out the traditional way that they actually would make negotiations with Native American groups and representatives. They would bring European goods over in a policy of gift giving. Well, the English commander in North America said, yeah, gift giving is expensive. The English can institute and force their will upon the Indians. And so we're going to not do that anymore. And combined with that and the way they were treated, a lot of the Delaware Indians, and one of the leaders is a man named Pontiac. He's an Ottawa Indian, one of the Delaware Indians are often in the Ohio Country Indians, among others. You can see some of the groups that are marked here in green. So what Pontiac, and he's kind of called the leader, although this is kind of an organic attack that happens on the British forts. And you can see all the explosions here and the separate little fires are where the British forts were actually taken by Indians. This is called Pontiac's Rebellion. So the first rebellion in North America doesn't come from white colonists. It actually comes from Native Americans who were really annoyed that the English had changed their policy. And these policies went into effect, no gift giving. And the English had to spend several years recapturing these forts, all the way up north here in the Michigan Territory. A few of them held out, one of them being Fort Pitt, that had to resort to this really desperate tactic of giving Indians who were besieging the fort smallpox-ridden blankets to kind of lift the siege, kind of engaging in germ warfare. So you see how desperate that was as far as the English point of view. So immediately they said, yeah, that wasn't a good idea to try to tighten our belt and cut off the gift-giving practices. We made a really critical mistake because gift-giving, it turns out, is a lot less expensive than war. So they changed that right away, and then they were going to institute some other policies. What Pontiac's Rebellion proved to the English was that it was probably pretty wise to keep the American colonists separate from the Native Americans in the West. And that was going to be the next part of the policies that are instigated after 1763 that we're going to continue.